Ground, VJet 201 Heavy ready for taxi. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, Canada 503 Heavy. Ran, Unity 977 at C134, request pushback. VJet 201 Heavy, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey VJet 201 Heavy. LE 960, cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking. Unity 612, cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking. Scandi 5 Heavy, contact departure. Contacting departure, Scandi 5 Heavy. Unity 977 cleared for pushback Unity 977. UNEX 543, cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking. Tower, UNEX 943 inbound for runway 22 left. Cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking, UNEX 543. UNEX 454, continue taxi. Cleared to land runway 22 left, UNEX 943. Continue taxi, UNEX 454. Hold position, UNEX 543. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, Canada 503 Heavy. Ground, Dallas 635 ready for taxi. Ran, Scandi 552 Heavy at B54, request pushback. Contacting departure, Canada 503 Heavy. UNEX 543, continue taxi. Continue taxi, UNEX 543. Scandi 552 Heavy cleared for pushback. Tower, Toronto 66 inbound for runway 11. Cleared for pushback Scandi 552 Heavy. Cleared to land runway 11, Toronto 66. Blue 752, cross runway 4 left and taxi to parking. Dallas 635, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. Cross runway 4 left and taxi to parking, Blue 752. Unity 590, cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey Dallas 635. Cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking, Unity 590. Tower, X-Cargo 553 inbound for runway 22 left. Ram, Unity 687 at C126, request pushback. Ground, Unity 977 ready for taxi. Cleared to land runway 22 left, X-Cargo 553. Unity 687 cleared for pushback. Cleared for pushback Unity 687. Hold position, Unity 590. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, Unity 413. Unity 977, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey Unity 977. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, Unity 413. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, UNEX 665. Ram, Unity 764 at C107, request pushback. Ram, Unity 103 at C112, request pushback. Unity 764 cleared for pushback. Cleared for pushback Unity 764. Unity 103 cleared for pushback. Ram, UNEX 570 at C87, request pushback. Cleared for pushback Unity 103. UNEX 570 cleared for pushback. Ran, X Cargo 539 at F1, request pushback. Unity 413, contact departure. Contacting departure, Unity 413. Tower, UNEX 419 inbound for runway 22 left. Cleared for pushback UNEX 570. X Cargo 539 cleared for pushback. Cleared to land runway 22 left, UNEX 419. Ground, Scandi 552 heavy ready for taxi. Cleared for pushback X Cargo 539. Unity 590, continue taxi. Continue taxi, Unity 590. Scandi 552 heavy, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, UNEX 665. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey Scandi 552 heavy. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, UNEX 171. Ram, Unity 214 at C103, request pushback. Unity 214 cleared for pushback. Ram, Unity 729 at C90, request pushback. Cleared for pushback Unity 214. Contacting departure, UNEX 665. Ground, X Cargo 539 ready for taxi. Ground, Unity 687 ready for taxi. Ops 1, cleared to conduct runway inspection, report when done. Proceed on to runway and report when done, Ops 1. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, UNEX 171. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, X Cargo 188. Unity 687, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. Tower, Unity 565 heavy inbound for runway 22 left. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey Unity 687. Cleared to land runway 22 left, Unity 565 heavy. Ground, Unity 764 ready for taxi. Ram, UNEX 792 at A25, request pushback. Unity 764, taxi to runway 22 right. Ground, Unity 103 ready for taxi. Taxi to runway 22 right Unity 764. UNEX 792 cleared for pushback. Unity 103, taxi to holding point. Ground, UNEX 570 ready for taxi. Cleared for pushback UNEX 792. UNEX 171, contact departure. Contacting departure, UNEX 171. Taxi to holding point Unity 103. Tower, X Cargo 657 inbound for runway 11. Hold position, Unity 687. Cleared to land runway 11, X Cargo 657. Unity 687, continue taxi. Continue taxi, Unity 687. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, X Cargo 188. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, VJet 201 heavy. Ram, UNEX 707 at C70, request pushback. UNEX 570, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. X Cargo 539, taxi to holding point. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey UNEX 570. Taxi to holding point X Cargo 539. Ground, Unity 214 ready for taxi. X Cargo 188, contact departure. Contacting departure, X Cargo 188. Ram, UNEX 715 at C115, request pushback. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, VJet 201 heavy. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, Swest 760. UNEX 454, cross runway 11. Tower, Emir 784 heavy inbound for runway 22 left. Cross runway 11, UNEX 454. Cleared to land runway 22 left, Emir 784 heavy. Hold position, Toronto 270. Ram, Unity 629 at C74, request pushback. Toronto 66, cross runway 4 left and taxi to parking. Ops 1, thank you, good day. Cross runway 4 left and taxi to parking, Toronto 66. Cross Tower, contacting departure, VJet, cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking, X Cargo 553. UNEX 419, cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking. Cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking, UNEX 419. Hold position, Unity 764. Ramp, Toronto 971 at B52, request pushback. Ramp, Unity 714 at C139, request pushback. Ground, UNEX 792 ready for taxi. Hold position, UNEX 419. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, Swest 760. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, Dallas 635. Hold position, X Cargo 539. X Cargo 539, continue taxi. Unity 214, taxi to runway 22 right. Continue taxi, X Cargo 539. UNEX 707 cleared for pushback. Taxi to runway 22 right Unity 214. Cleared for pushback UNEX 707. Unity 729 cleared for pushback. Cleared for pushback Unity 729. UNEX 792, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. Hold position, UNEX 943. Swest 760, contact departure. Contacting departure, Swest 760. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey UNEX 792. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, Dallas 635. Toronto 270, continue taxi. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, Scandi 552 heavy. Continue taxi, Toronto 270. Ops 1, cleared to conduct runway inspection, report when done. Ram, X Cargo 282 heavy at F31, request pushback. Proceed onto runway and report when done, Ops 1. Unity 764, continue taxi. Continue taxi, Unity 764. Contacting departure, Dallas 635. UNEX 943, continue taxi. Continue taxi, UNEX 943. Unity 629 cleared for pushback. UNEX 419, continue taxi. Toronto 971 cleared for pushback. Cleared for pushback Unity 629. Unity 714 cleared for pushback. Continue taxi, UNEX 419. X Cargo 282 heavy cleared for pushback. Tower, Unity 37 inbound for runway 11. Cleared for pushback Toronto 971. Cleared to land runway 11, Unity 37. Cleared for pushback Unity 714. Cleared for pushback X Cargo 282 heavy. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, Scandi 552 heavy. Ground, UNEX 707 ready for taxi. Unity 565 heavy, cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking. Scandi 552 heavy, contact departure. Contacting departure, Scandi 552 heavy. Cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking, Unity 565 heavy. Ground, Unity 729 ready for taxi. Emir 784 heavy, cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking. Cross runway 22 right and taxi to parking, Emir 784 heavy. Ram, Super Tug 468 at B65, request pushback. Unity 729, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. UNEX 707, taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey Unity 729. Ground, Toronto 971 ready for taxi. UNEX 715 cleared for pushback. Taxi to runway 22 right at Whiskey UNEX 707. Cleared for pushback UNEX 715. Toronto 971, taxi to runway 22 right. Taxi to runway 22 right Toronto 971. Hold position, UNEX 419. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, Unity 977. Super Tug 468 cleared for pushback. Cleared for pushback Super Tug 468. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, Unity 977. Ground, Unity 629 ready for taxi. Line up and wait runway 22 right at Whiskey, Toronto 270. Ground, Unity 714 ready for taxi. Unity 764, cross runway 11. Ram, Super Tug 612 at B64, request pushback. Cross runway 11, Unity 764. Ground, Super Tug 468 ready for taxi. Ram, LE434 at B53, request pushback. LE434 cleared for pushback. Cleared for pushback LE434. Super Tug 468, taxi to gate C128. Taxi to gate C128 Super Tug 468. Contacting departure, Unity 9, ground, AUX1, thank you, good day. Tower, UNEX 84 inbound for runway 22 left. Cleared to land runway 22 left, UNEX 84. Ram, Dallas 643 at B45, request pushback. Cleared for takeoff runway 22 right at Whiskey, Toronto 270. Line up and wait runway 22 right, UNEX 454. Super Tug 612 cleared for pushback. Cleared for pushback Super Tug 612. UNEX 419, continue taxi. Tower, AUX1 at runway 4 left, request clearance to conduct runway inspection. Continue taxi, UNEX 419. Toronto 270, contact departure. Contacting departure, Toronto 270. X-Cargo 657, cross runway 4 left and taxi to parking. Ground, UNEX 715 ready for taxi. Cross runway 4 left and taxi to parking, X-Cargo 657. Unity 629, taxi to runway 22 right. Taxi to hold.